Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being, welcome back. Henri Bergson video 10. So in this video we're going to be looking at matter and spirit. Basically we're coming to this is the end of matter and memory. So we're just about there. I think the next video or a couple of videos later we're going to start, we're going to move into creative evolution. But yep, so we're at the end of matter and memory, talking about how matter and spirit coincide, I guess. Bergson is a dualist. I've said that before. He believes there are two fundamental what can we say? They're not things. They're not substances. He's not a substance dualist as such, but there are two fundamental and opposing forces, if you like. And we'll kind of look at them here. They'll get a fuller treatment at the end of creative evolution, though. But anyway, in matter and memory, we'll look at what Bergson has to say about the two sides of his dualism, how they fit together, how they coincide. So matter and spirit, those are the two, and they are completely different. I've said that in the last 3 videos. I've repeated that matter and spirit, or memory, or mind, these things are totally separate. They're not the same, although they never occur individually. They never occur without the other. We always have that interaction, but they are still fundamentally different things. Differences in kind, not differences in degree. And that's the mistake of materialism and idealism. Materialism says everything's reducible to matter and then has to struggle to deal with mind. And idealism says the opposite. Everything is reducible to mind and then can't explain material things. So they're both kind of, both of those, I guess, monisms, the materialism and idealism, they want to reduce everything to one thing. They end up being unable to account for the other. So Bergson's going to say there are two fundamental things here, matter and spirit. Pure perception puts us in matter, so that gets us into what matter is itself, right? Pure perception totally gets us out of our heads, if you like, and into the things that are out there. We've looked at how that happens. And pure memory puts us in spirit. So that's where we have found already that memory pulls us away from spirit but not into a subjective consciousness or something that means nothing, that we can't explain. But it pulls us back into this other dualism, this other half of the dualism, which is spirit. We'll flesh this out as we go on today. However, despite the fact that those two things are so separate, pure perception and matter, pure memory and spirit, pure perception must also refer to the subject. So there's not a complete break here. Although they're different, there isn't a sense of overlap. That's kind of what Bergson's getting at. Same with pure memory, it must also connect to matter in some way. Or else we talked about pure, it's just, what's the word he uses? Virtual. It's just virtual. But in order for it to become actual, to become real, if you like, then it has to descend into the world of matter. And we looked at how that happens in the last couple of videos. So the connection's there, even though they're very separate. And this, basically the aim of this video is to reconcile these oppositions that we tend to throw up between the extended and the unextended, and between quality and quantity, to see how and where they can overlap. And so let's start by looking at Bergson's method. So here Bergson distinguishes useful knowledge from true knowledge. And you can kind of think of useful knowledge as it's the scientific approach, if you like, the physics of the world, and true knowledge being metaphysics. So what the world is really like, if you like. Because as we've seen, Bergson's all about action. Fundamentally, we are engaged in the world, directed towards things. We use things in order to further our goals and so on and so forth. But that doesn't necessarily tell us what those things are. So there is a distinction to be made between useful knowledge and true knowledge. Here's my quote. The duration wherein we see ourselves acting, and in which it is useful that we should see ourselves, is a duration whose elements are dissociated and juxtaposed. The duration wherein we act is a duration wherein our states melt into each other. It is within this that we should try to replace ourselves by thought. Okay, cool. And that's basically just what I said. There are two kinds of knowledge here, with the duration in which we see ourselves acting, so kind of a refraction of what's really going on, like kind of a late something. I'm stuttering my way through I think a reflection is a good way. So once the act is finished, then we look at it, we reflect on it. That's what he's talking about when he says we see ourselves acting. And it's useful that we should see ourselves acting. That's what drives science. But this is a duration in which the elements are juxtaposed and dissociated. That's a duration which is space, right? But the duration wherein we act, so when we're actually acting, not when we look back and think about what we were doing when we were acting, that's one in which our states melt into each other. That gets us that duration, I said, infused with memory. So the normal facts of life are actually an adaptation of the real to the interests of practice and the exigencies of social life. So that's how we... it's what we need in order to live our lives. So this is not, Bergson's not anti this way of dealing with the world. This kind of artificial abstraction that we create, in which time is space, and things appear in relation to our goals and our needs. He's not against that, which is science too, right? But we're just recognizing it for what it is. It's not a reflection of what the world really is. It's not a reflection of a true metaphysical reality. It's a breaking up of that continuity, which we saw in duration, into elements which are laid side by side in space as words or objects. And so the mistake of materialism and idealism is they both start too late. They start after what Bergson calls the turn. So after the point where the real becomes human experience, after the real has been shaped, has been conditioned by our practical goals. That's the point at which materialism and idealism both come in and start trying to explain things, which is too late, because they're trying to explain a world which has already been conditioned by our goals and our interests, our practical, the practical drives that make up human life. If we want to understand reality itself, metaphysics, we have to go back beyond that, back past that point at which the real gets turned into the useful. And so that's what Bergson's doing here. We already used this method, by the way. So this is Bergson's method, distinguishing between useful knowledge and true knowledge. We already used this in Time and Free Will when we talked about what I call metaphysical freedom there. So we're free not because we are an uncaused entity, which would be, again, coming to the party too late. We'll be looking at things after you've already missed what makes us free, which is that fundamental that fundamental continuity and the contracting and the prolonging of those states that are in that succession, which is duration. If you come to the party after that, you've already missed where freedom is. So we went in Time and Free Will, we went further back and saw we were free, not because we're an uncaused entity, but because we are freedom itself as duration, as those psychic states which are continuous, which melt into each other, and form a whole. That's where our freedom comes from the fact that we are fundamentally duration. But if you come in too late, you miss that, and then everything that you conclude from that point on is erroneous, because you're dealing with an abstraction. You're dealing with a reality which has already been, I want to say twisted, but that has a very negative connotation, but has already been kind of molded to our desires, to our practical ends. So that's Bergson's method, distinguishing useful knowledge from true knowledge, and there are 4 propositions that emerge when we apply this. Let's have a look at those now. The first is that every movement appears as absolutely indivisible. And this is a central feature of Bergson's philosophy. A process cannot be divided. You can't divide a process. If you divide a process, you just get 2 processes. And so if you keep dividing processes, you're not really, you're not getting to the core of what the process is, because processes are fundamentally indivisible. You have to treat them as a whole. The whole is more than the parts, than simply the addition of the parts, the sum of the parts. Only things, only objects, only things that we've already broken off from that continuity that makes up the world, only those things can be divided. That is to say, only abstract things, only things that we have already we've already broken apart and cleaved off from that continuous succession that is metaphysical reality. The second proposition is that there are real movements. So he talks about the mathematician's movement actually being changes in length, not real movement. So position for the mathematician is simply distance from a point, length, and movement is just the variation of that distance. So then from that way of approaching movement, there is no absolute movement. There is no real, genuine movement. There's only relative movement, movement in relation to another point, and that is totally spatial and nothing more than length. So it has no, it fails to account for genuine movement. Because relative movement, the same object is in motion or motionless according to the points to which it's referred. And this is just relativity, right? So in relativity, there is no absolute movement. You can't say that anything moves, because to say that one thing moves is always to say it moves in relation to another thing. And in relation to a third thing, it may not move. It may be stationary. So for mathematics and for science, for physics, movement is not, in a sense, it's not real. It's not genuine. There is no genuine movement, only relative movement. So that's the second proposition. There are real movements. If there were no real movement, nothing would change. This is how Bergson sees it. And this is kind of obvious, right? If things really didn't move, if there was only these changes in length that accounted for movement, if movement was always relative, nothing would ever change. You just get relative change, right? There'd be no genuine sense in which things change. It's kind of obviously not true. It's not the way that reality is. We realize that things change. We know that, we feel it, but we've learned to trust the numbers, trust the math over our own intuition, over our own sense of understanding the world. And in some cases that has turned out to be useful, right? Like the notion that the Earth is a sphere. So it doesn't make sense to our intuition, it seems like, it's flat. So there are cases where we have to change our intuitions. But what Bergson's saying, I guess, is this is not one of them. There is real change. To deny that, that's not quite the same as saying the Earth is round as opposed to flat. That's more like a denial of human experience. And if you're prepared to go that far, then I think in support of your physics, then it's I mean, everything just kind of drifts into nothingness at that point, right? If we can't trust, if there is no such thing really as human experience, change is an illusion. Then we're off the rails. Consciousness is an illusion as well. You're not. We're really robots. Everything's determined. Blah blah blah. We have to kind of. I guess it's being reasonable. That would be the only thing you could say here. We can't deny change. Change is real. Absolute change is real. But we reject this, like I say, to make our intuitions align with the mathematics. And the irony of maths is that it precisely cannot capture motion. It cannot capture duration. So there's another problem there where we've put our trust in a system which from the very beginning excludes motion and excludes true temporal change. So it's no surprise that the math tells us there is no real change because it's not equipped to deal with it. And that's not going to work for Bergson. Every movement is absolutely indivisible, and there are real movements. Those are the first two propositions. The third proposition is that all division of matter into independent bodies with absolutely determined outlines is artificial. And I'll start this one off with a quote. A moving continuity is given to us, in which everything changes and yet remains. Whence comes it that we dissociate the two terms, permanence and change, and then represent permanence by bodies and change by homogeneous movements in space? And the answer to that question is exigencies of daily life, which is what science studies. And it's what phenomenology studies too, right? Phenomenology studies how we the lived human experience. But it doesn't go into the metaphysics. It deals with our experience with things as we perceive them, as we're able to perceive them. But that's what we have. We're given this moving continuity. Everything changes and yet everything remains. But we break it apart. We insist that there has to be something permanent here. And those permanent things are the bodies. And the change then is just the movement in space, which is just a relative change. But for Bergson, that dissociation, that breaking up of that continuity into permanence and change is only for human life, human existence. We can't live any other way. So again, this is Bergson's not disparaging science. He's not disparaging that practical approach. We must have it. There is no such thing as human life if we get rid of that. But it doesn't tell us anything about reality itself. So all division of matter into individual bodies, that is artificial. In some sense, we have cleaved up this whole, this continuous whole, into parts which, in truth, are not separate. They're not necessarily like the same, right? But there are differences in the different parts here that make up the whole. But fundamentally, they are one thing. We have to, if we want to understand reality, we have to consider them as not separate parts put together, but as inclusive parts in the whole, as parts which are fundamentally included in the whole. And when we don't do that, or what we do in our normal mode of living, mode of existence, is break that apart. And just an interesting note too, science is actually, physics is getting on board with this idea. As far as I'm aware anyway, the latest theory is that the smallest fundamental particles are not things. They're not little lumps of matter. They are vibrations of quantum fields which extend throughout the whole universe. And that's about as good a description of a continuous reality as you could get, right? Quantum fields that extend throughout the whole universe, and the vibrations in different parts is what makes up what we perceive as atoms. That's Bergson right there. It's Bergson brought into science, into physics. So that's nice to see that anyway. That kind of science is catching up with Bergson, you might say. Okay, so three things. Every movement is absolutely indivisible. There are real movements. All division of matter into independent bodies is artificial. And the last point, the last proposition, real movement is the transference of a state, not of a thing. So real movements here then, they're not quantity. They're not extended in space. They're not infinitely divisible. Rather, they are quality. They are, which is to say, they are states of a continuous succession of states. Their quality, which is itself vibrating internally, beating to their own duration and continuity, similar to our own psychic states. And that's a really important point. There is a connection here between our psychic states, which we looked at in Time and Free Will, which are a plurality, are a multiplicity, but because they melt into each other, right? All of our past states we carry with us into every moment, but wrapped up into a single intuition, apprehensible in a single intuition. That's what our psychic states are. That's the duration of psychic states. And Bergson's saying the same thing is happening at the level of the universe, the level of reality. Reality is also not quantity, not things which are measurable, not bodies which we can divide, but they are fundamentally quality, like that qualitative multiplicity we saw related to psychic states. All you have in nature is or are states, a succession of states that are bound together, that can be prolonged and contracted into a present moment. but they're all there. They're all a part of this this larger entity, although I don't want to use, I hesitate to use that word, which we call reality, nature. So hopefully that makes sense as I've explained it there. Anyway, let's keep moving. The qualities that that Bergson gives as an example of this, he talks about red and blue, which are different sensations. So they're heterogeneous. But this is mainly because of the duration into which we contract the vibrations. So there's nothing fixed about red or blue. There's nothing that makes those things, those colors, separate from each other. And in fact, they only appear different because the difference is in the wavelength, right, which we perceive in different ways. If we could stretch out our duration, if we could alter our duration, that the way that the frequency at which we perceive these electromagnetic radiation, we would see these colors pale and lengthen into successive impressions, succession, continuity of states. Still colored, no doubt, Bergson says, but nearer and nearer to coincidence with pure vibrations. And that again, that idea, pure vibrations, that's movement. It's a succession of states, which is continuous. That's what reality is fundamentally. It's not a collection of clumps of matter dispersed here and there that are discrete, that are separate. Ultimately, everything is reducible to these, or almost reducible to these pure vibrations. Everything is beating to the tune of their own duration. They are fundamentally movement, qualitative. And so that's what we would see if we could stretch our duration out, if we could alter the rate at which we perceive things, we would see color eventually melt into movement. And that's true for everything, not just color, but even things like atoms, right? And when atoms join together into objects, obviously that holds for that as well. What are atoms? We just said the vibrations of quantum fields. So back to movement. So movement is really at the core of this for Bergson, and that's what makes reality a succession, a continuous succession, which means that it shares the same features that our psychic states do. And these different speeds of duration, by the way, Bergson calls tension. And we'll come back to this at the end of Creative Evolution. But basically, the higher the tension, the closer to perceiving or apprehending kind of metaphysical reality. The further we get from the everyday picture of things as separate, discrete objects, which are independent. That the higher the tension, the closer we get to perceiving the continuous succession of states, which is reality itself. So movement is fundamentally quality. That is to say, it's those states which are part of that continuous succession under a different aspect. So movement and quality are not fundamentally different. They are just, movement is quality seen under a different aspect. But we fail to see this normally because we attribute movement to discrete elements that we've artificially carved out of the whole in perception. And so Bergson says here, to perceive is to immobilize. It's to take the motion out of things. I like that expression. To perceive is to immobilize, crystallizes things, locks them into fixed objects. When in reality, they're not they are states. They're a continuous succession rather than these fixed things. So of the extended object, Bergson says it is motionless on the surface, but in its very depth it lives and vibrates. So we're back to that idea of atoms. It doesn't just apply to things like red and blue, to colours, but things themselves. They appear motionless on the surface. They appear fixed as what they are. But in their very depths, they live and vibrate. Beautiful expression. Let me give you a quote. Matter thus resolves itself into numberless vibrations, all linked together in uninterrupted continuity, all bound up with each other, and travelling in every direction like shivers through an immense body. Beautiful. That's kind of what you might expect to get from some kind of new agey mystical kind of philosophy. I hate using that word for that kind of thing, but some mystical position on reality. But it's philosophy. It's Bergson. It's grounded in he has his feet on the ground, I would say. We're not often talking about things like energy and psychic phenomena and the power of attraction or positive thinking, drawing money to yourself, drawing success to your, none of this kind of talk, and yet we still have this. It just shows, right, the kernel of truth that lies at the bottom of many of these kind of mystic, new age, cultish type movements, and also religions too. I'm thinking particularly of Buddhism. There are many analogies to Buddhism from Bergson that one could draw from Bergson, but again, he doesn't go off the rails. He's not postulating therefore some force that unites us all, which we can, if we meditate for enough hours, we can tap into and become one with, merge into. We don't have to go that route, but there is that. It's just interesting to see, I guess, that kernel of truth that underlies those things. Bergson's there, but he doesn't go off the rails. I like it. So matter resolves itself into numberless vibrations, cool, all connected, bound up in uninterrupted continuity. So how is the separation of objects from the environment achieved? That's a good question. How do we achieve this abstraction in which we take what is fundamentally quality, fundamentally a state, fundamentally continuous succession? How do we take that and carve it up into discrete elements? By spreading beneath the continuity of sensible qualities, that is to say, beneath concrete extensity, a network of which the meshes may be altered to any shape whatsoever and become as small as we please. This substratum, which is merely conceived, this wholly ideal diagram of arbitrary and infinite divisibility, is homogeneous space. And that is how we cleave up the world. We see it in terms of space. We reduce everything. We lay out this spatial network, this background on which everything can be cut up, divided, can be cleaved. And we do that again, it's not an act that we willfully do, right? We don't deliberately intend this. It's just the way that life has evolved, right? It's the way that our sense organs have evolved. It's the way that this comes back to what we'll look more at in creative evolution, the evolution of life, right? It's not like something that you're doing now and that you can learn to undo, or that you can change, right? So, and that's again like where I think religions tend to go off the rails, because they tend to say in their system of salvation, their method of salvation, we can undo that. We can go beyond this, the everyday. But for Bergson, this is how we've evolved. This is part of what it is to be a human being, a living creature, having experiences. You can't undo it. You can't just change your way of perceiving. This is what we are. This is who we are. It's how we live. There's no undoing this. But that's how it's achieved. That's how we break up this continuity into separate, discrete objects. And at this point, I'd like to take a quick look at matter and just see what this is. So this section is actually from Creative Evolution, but I'm bringing it in here, bringing it in early because we're talking about matter here, matter and spirit, and we just talked about what matter is. It's this fundamentally, it's a continuity. It resolves into numberless vibrations. It's movement, right? And so I thought it would be worth just taking a quick preview of what we're going to say about matter a little bit later in Creative Evolution, but which applies quite nicely here as well. So there are three aspects to matter Bergson talks about in Creative Evolution. The first are qualities. And as we've seen, all quality is change. There is nothing fixed underneath this, i.e. nothing that changes. So this gets rid of that notion that there is, qualities change, but there has to be some permanent substrata that doesn't change. An essence, a substance, we're getting rid of that. All quality is change, and there's nothing fixed underneath this. There's nothing permanent that on which the change happens. But that's the first aspect of matter, qualities. The second aspect is form. And I've got a quote for this one. There is no form, since form is immobile and the reality is movement. What is real is the continual change of form. Form is only a snapshot view of a transition. Therefore, here again, our perception manages to solidify into discontinuous images the fluid continuity of the real. When the successive images do not differ from each other too much, we consider them all as the waxing and waning of a single mean image, or as the deformation of this image in different directions. And to this mean we really allude when we speak of the essence of a thing, or of the thing itself. And that's nice, right? Again, same with qualities. Qualities are change. Form also is a snapshot view of a transition. Form is it's not the illusion. That's probably too strong. It's the way that we carve up reality, which obscures the fact, the truth, that reality is fundamentally movement. Form is immobile, the reality is movement, therefore there is no form at the metaphysical level, at the level of that we're looking at here. So cool, that's the second aspect. And the third aspect of matter are acts. And not acts, but acting. And when it comes to acts, we do see the movement. Right? When we're acting, we see the movement, but we only focus on the destination and the start point, right? But that's all we see. Again, that's what that's our practical nature. It's just what it is to be a human being, a living creature, to focus on not the movement, but on what you're moving towards. And that's what we do. We focus on our destinations. That is to say, we focus on the eventual state rather than the change that happens in the middle. And so we lose that, again, we lose the sense that reality is motion. We lose that that understanding. So those are the three aspects of matter: qualities, form, and acts. And I've got a picture which hopefully captures some of this in a bit more detail. Bergson talks about this. This picture isn't from the book. He doesn't describe it pictorially like this, but I think it just clarifies a little bit. There are three movements in reality for Bergson that are fundamental, and we can break that down into three: the qualitative, the evolutionary, and the extensive. And those three movements in reality are reflected, or refracted maybe is better, in three stable views in perception. And these become qualities, a form of essences, and acts. And then we continue the abstraction into three categories of words, so into language, in which we get adjectives, nouns, and verbs. And so you can see how we're moving from that, from the top to the bottom. We're moving from reality, increasing levels of abstraction as we go down, until we get to the third level, which is the most abstract, language. And the middle level there, which is matter. So that, I think that's a really nice picture, actually. It's a really nice way of capturing both what fundamental reality is at a metaphysical level, and also showing how we progress, how we break that fundamental reality into the world that the world of the everyday, the world that we live in, the world that we have to live in. Again, it's not something we can, nor is it something we should want to get rid of. We don't want to do that. We can't do it even if we wanted to. Even if you want to stop perceiving objects out there, you can't. It's just what it is to be a human being. But we can place ourselves there. We can place ourselves beyond that in our imagination through philosophy. That's what philosophy is for Bergson. It's going beyond that, not to genuinely experience. Now, this isn't a mystical transformation or anything. It's not, you're not dissolving into fundamental reality in any real way, but you're kind of placing yourself in reality itself. You're moving. It's an act of mind still, right? You're still thinking. You're still. That's what you're doing. Philosophy. Bergson calls it intuition, actually, and we'll look at that later. It's going to come up later, but yeah. What was I talking about, man? How did I get to intuition from that? But yeah, so that diagram, I think it's a nice description, brings everything together, shows us how we move from metaphysical truth to the truth of the everyday. Final section, uniting body and soul. Okay, so we've got matter, the body, physical, and we've got soul, spirit, memory. These are all kind of words that mean the same thing. So if the mental state, psychic states, which again are they're not, perhaps they're not the same as memory. It's not quite right to say that, but I would say they are grounded in memory, which is, memory is nothing more than the past, but a past which has been prolonged, right, into the present and contracted into a single intuition, into a single apprehension. And so, and that succession of states, which has been prolonged and contracted into the present, that's memory. That is what our psychic states are grounded in. So that's kind of the relation that I see between those things. So anyway, we've got this mental state, which is memory, which is a continuity of states melted into one another, prolonged and contracted into the present. And virtual, right? So still at this level, when we're talking about the mental, soul, spirit, memory, this is virtual. It's not actual. But this draws nearer to extension as it evolves towards actuality, towards action, towards that sensory motor present. And that, remember Bergson's cone. Remember that cone where memory contracts and rotates so that it can fit, so that it can apply itself to a particular sensory motor present. And in doing so, it becomes actual. It has its life breathed back into it, if you like. So that's the connection, right? So we've taken something which has nothing to do with extended reality, the world as it is around us, and the extended world, and there's a connection there. The way that it progresses, it's able to bring itself to bear on the sensory motor present, which is extension. And on the other way, from the other side, extension is actually in its core undivided, continuous. It's a continuous succession of states, numberless vibrations beating to their own duration. So extension also has this aspect of the mental, this aspect of duration, which is what memory is grounded in. So if those things are true, mental state draws nearer to extension as it evolves towards actuality, and extension is itself actually, in its core, undivided, a continuous succession. Then spirit can rest upon matter and consequently unite with it in the act of pure perception, yet nevertheless be radically distinct from it. It is distinct from matter in that it is even then memory, that is to say, a synthesis of past and present with a view to the future, in that it contracts the moments of this matter in order to use them and to manifest itself by actions which are the final aim of its union with the body. And so there we can see in pure perception, subject and the object coincide. Not that they're the same, they don't reduce to the same thing, but they coincide in the sense that they overlap. And the point of overlap is duration, continuity. So they coincide there in pure perception, and we see them at that point in their respective durations. So we see matter and its duration, which is those numberless vibrations. It's that continuity of reality, and the duration of memory, mental states, which is the melting together of those psychic states into one, bringing the past into the present, again prolonging and contracting. That's the respective. That's the duration of psychic states of the mental, and it's that point, that duration, which is the overlap between matter and memory, matter and soul. So I just wanted to drill down on that. I've got a little bit more to say here. Matter appears as a rapid succession of movements. Rapid succession of moments, which again is connected with that idea of movement, continuity, each deducible from the other. So there's a sense in which there's a connection between these moments. They're not separate, isolated moments. There is a continuity running through them. And spirit, as memory, is a prolonging of the past into the present, a progress, a true evolution. Again, that is succession of moments, succession of states. And it's that which lets us bring the two together so that they can coexist without contradiction. The two, of course, are still distinct, so that's an important point, but a union is possible in pure perception because this, as the lowest degree of mind without memory, is really a part of matter. And again, so that we can see again that the close bond between these two things. They are separate, but matter is, or the lowest degree of mind without memory, is really what matter is. So again, it's just another way of saying the same thing. There's a meeting point. There's a point at which they overlap, and that's in pure perception, which is the world out there, right? It's pure perception is the object that we perceive without memory, with no trace of memory. It's just what's out there, kind of being received by us, being that we are aware of, and that the thing without memory is the lowest degree of mind and is matter. The connection's there. So yeah, matter participates in a duration not exactly like, but not unlike, the one our own conscious states evolve through. Memory then simply takes the continuous duration that is already there in nature and prolongs and contracts it into a lived duration. And this is what I meant when I said that memory is the engine of duration. And so I just kind of threw that in, but it might be worth just taking a moment to dwell on that. I'm not sure if Bergson says this or if this is how I've interpreted him in trying to fit all the pieces together. But this is certainly at least how I've interpreted it. I can't remember if Bergson says it in exactly this way, but for the way that I see it, memory, what it does is just it takes this continuous succession, which is nature, which is already there in nature, prolongs and contracts it into a lived duration. And so in this sense, it's the driving force behind our psychic states, which enables us to exist, which enables us to endure. It's probably the best way to put it. But viewed in this way, then, there is no inherent contradiction in the relation between body and soul, mind and matter, or quality and quantity. Even though they don't reduce to the same thing, they share this commonality, which we can apprehend, which we can understand in pure perception. Okay, let's hit a summary. So first thing we looked at was Bergson's method, and this is very simple, just to distinguish useful knowledge from true knowledge. Then we looked at the 4 propositions which follow from Bergson's method when we follow this kind of metaphysical path. The first proposition, every movement is indivisible. Second proposition, there are real movements. So movement is not relative. There are absolute movements. Third proposition, the division of matter into bodies is artificial. It doesn't reflect the true metaphysical picture. And the fourth proposition, real movement is the transference of a state, not a thing. And that's probably the most difficult one to get your head around, but the basic idea is that real movement is continuous. It's a part of this qualitative multiplicity, which we've already seen in psychic states. That's what movement ultimately is. It's quality, which is to say it is states in a continuous succession. The next thing we looked at was matter itself. We broke matter down into 3 aspects: qualities, form, and acts. Qualities were fundamentally change. Form, there was no form. Form is immobile. The reality is movement. So form is a snapshot view of a transition. And acts, which are real, but obviously are genuine movement. We tend to focus only on the destinations. The idea basically with these three things is that they are all change. They're all movement. They're all connected with movement, i.e. they're not fixed, not static things. And finally, we looked at uniting the body and soul. And we saw that spirit, soul, memory, mental, psychic states, spirit is a continuity that approaches extension, whereas matter or extension is actually a continuity. And it's there that the two come together, the two overlap. They unite in pure perception, which is matter, which is also the lowest form of mind. And that's our connection. So hopefully that made some sense. Great book, Matter and Memory. It is, I think, the most difficult certainly the most difficult of the three that I've read: Time and Free Will, Matter and Memory, Creative Evolution. But there are some insights in that book that I think are truly you really have to grapple with if you want to understand Bergson properly. That's where I'm going to finish here. Thanks everyone. Thanks for listening. I hope that helped. And I'll see you in the next video.